It's excellent to have you with us. If I can do a formal introduction to Alice, who has worked for the public and private sectors in the areas of city and urban planning and real estate before. She's a chartered member of the RTPI and the Irish Planning Institute. She's got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Queen's University, Belfast. Alice is an external board member of the Planning Advisory Committee of NAMA in Ireland. And in 2017, she received the Echo Irish Under 40s Award, which recognizes Irish and Irish Americans who have distinguished themselves in their respective fields of work. Alice is the lead of cities, infrastructure and urban services of the World Economic Forum. And she will be speaking to us today about the Great Reset, cities post-COVID. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Andreas. The bit you forgot is that we used to work together. Many years ago.
That was the highlight of my career.
and mine, of course. we actually realized that we hadn't seen each other in 9 years. Is that correct? Yeah, 9 years. So
right.
So we used to work together for a number of years, and it's really good to see.
Colin Buchanan, yes.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Which is now Jacobs, right? So
yeah.
So listen, thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to try and take you through just some thinking in terms of what are the emerging trends that we've seen in respect of cities, the strategies that cities are embracing to recover post-COVID, and also just a little bit of the real estate sector, because that's really important to consider in terms of the recovery of cities. So as you heard, I'm Alice Charles from the World Economic Forum. I look after a number of different groups at the World Economic Forum. We're an international organization for public-private cooperation. So that means that I work with cities, first of all, and I run something called the Global Future Council on Cities and Urbanization at the Forum. And that includes, for example, Rob Adams, who's due to present to you, I know, in a couple of days, from the city of Melbourne, and many other experts from cities and city leaders, academics, business leaders who are leading in the area of cities. And we very much work together to think about future strategies in respect of cities. We've done a lot of work, for example, on smart cities, on innovation. And in the coming months, we will be working on alternative revenue sources for cities, bearing in mind the situation that we're in, as well as thinking about how we can restructure capital investment. I also lead the real estate community. So that means working with global CEOs of real estate and adjacent companies, the likes of Jacobs and Arup. So it's developers of real estate, investors in real estate, advisors in relation to real estate and adjacent industries. And at the moment, we're rethinking the future of real estate. So what I will be presenting to you today will be largely drawing upon the work that we've been doing in those two communities. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, if you just bear with me for 1 second. Apologies, it's just not coming up, so if you just bear with me. I hope you can all see that. Yeah? Stephen, you can see it your side?
We've got it, yes. Yep.
Okay, so as I said on the agenda, emerging trends in cities and recovery strategies, and emerging trends in real estate, and a framework to transition the industry. So first of all, if I turn to emerging trends in cities, what we've seen as a result of COVID is, of course, a rapid move towards mass sustainable mobility. And whether that's in New York or London or San Francisco or Bogota, or just yesterday, I received an email from the mayor of Milan who was telling me everything that he is doing to develop cycleways within his city. So, it's really becoming a global movement to try and get people on bikes, get people walking and using public transit. However, some cities, and we've seen that early on in China, we're seeing people leaving public transit and going to the car rather than going to, getting on their bikes and walking. So I guess a critical question for cities is, how might cities enable more people to use sustainable transport modes while maintaining social distancing? But added to that is, how do we get people back on public transit? And that's something that many cities are grappling with in their recovery strategy. The second thing that we've seen is a huge hurried transition to virtual delivery of services. So whether that's universities, whether it's schools, whether it's our businesses, whether it's culture, whether it's health, we've seen, for example, huge advances in telehealth. We're seeing this virtual delivery of services. In the same way, our cities are having to think, how can we virtually deliver our services? And again, that's feeding into recovery strategies. Another thing, and in fact, Andreas and I were talking about this just before we started, isolation and mental health challenges have really increased since lockdown. You know, what we were talking about was when we started to open up in Switzerland, we had to work with our teams to see, you know, who wanted to go back first. And we discovered, for example, a lot of our younger staff who were on their own desperately wanted to go back because they were having difficulties with their mental health as a result of COVID. And it's not just younger populations, it was older populations who were cocooning. So questions for cities are, how might cities support social connections during a time of social distancing? Or how might you allow protest? You know, one of the really interesting things, I was talking very early on to Hera Barron, who's the CTO of Amsterdam, and Hera was saying, we need to allow people to protest virtually in a democracy. So that was something they were considering. And they were considering, how do we get people into green space so that, you know, they're able to replenish their thoughts. And, you know, they were developing a booking system for their parks to maintain social distancing, but ensure that people got time with nature, for example. Another thing that we have seen is that open innovation has been flourishing. So, you know, there's lots of hackathons. For example, Estonia runs online global hackathons to solve COVID-19 challenges. But it's not just Estonia, many other cities. We've had it in the city I live in Geneva in Switzerland. So again, it's how might cities involve others in creating solutions to novel challenges? So how can you leverage your startup community your academic community to help solve your challenges? So I guess the top issues that we've been hearing, and by the way, this is from working with cities around the world, is how might cities enable existing industries and businesses to transform and stay viable? And when I come on to real estate later, I will talk about distressed assets. I will talk about retail. I'll talk about hospitality. So retail and hospitality are very much what I'm thinking of there. How might cities encourage new industries and businesses to emerge and thrive? And that's particularly, for example, in the digital sector or in the safety sector. How might cities support changing urban land use, infrastructure, and space needs? And of course, that's all about how might we use our spaces whilst maintaining social distancing. How might cities accelerate our digital infrastructure? We're desperately needing 5G infrastructure right now. So how can we do that? But how can we maintain privacy? You know, for example, we've seen this huge adjustment to facial recognition technology in Chinese cities. However, if we were to embrace that concept in Western cities, there's real questions that need to be addressed in terms of ethics and privacy. And I guess the fifth point is, how might cities understand the implications of systems change and what it might mean for governments and democracy? And the final issue that they're seeking to focus on is, how might cities maintain and develop a focus on community cohesion, mental health, and identity? And we've seen that, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. So cross-cutting priorities in cities are around addressing social equity, addressing climate change, addressing resilience and prosperity. Some of the strategies that have been emerging as a result are, for example, the Paris solution, the 15-minute city. And it's fair to say that this actually was something that Paris was putting forward before COVID-19. It was part of Mayor Hidalgo's election campaign to be re-elected as mayor of Paris. And really what she was promoting there was that everything that we need as citizens in a city to live, work, and play should be within 15 minutes of our neighborhood. And a central prong of that was that we should be able to walk or cycle to avail of what we need to live and work in our city. But of course, you as urbanists know that's not new. And I'm delighted that you are going to be hearing from Rob Adams later in the week, because you know, this is something that Rob has been working very hard on in the city of Melbourne for a number of years in terms of the 20-minute neighbourhood. And there what you've seen was they are promoting housing diversity, you know, the ability of people to age in place, that you have affordable accommodation, that you have safe streets, but also you have recreational spaces close to where you live, that you've community gardens, that you've green streets, that you have local playgrounds and parks. And one of the things actually in that regard that Rob will often say, and I'm sure he will actually tell you that next week, is he monitors success and he determines his success based on how much tarmac he gets rid of in his city. And I think it's a great way of looking at it. But also in those neighborhoods, he wants to have, you know, centers of education, local schools, lifelong learning, shopping facilities, local employment facilities, and that development should be transit oriented and you should be able to walk and cycle in those neighborhoods. So the Paris 15-minute city concept may be getting a lot of attention, and you're seeing mayors like the mayor of Milan saying, I am going to embrace it, I'm going to implement it too. So it's getting a lot of attention, but actually the 20-minute neighborhood has been there for some time. Another model which is being promoted by the Mayor of Amsterdam is coming out of Oxford, where Stephen is, out of Oxford University. And this is the whole concept of donut economics. So I guess what they are saying, using this theory in the city of Amsterdam, is if you look at the inner circle of this donut, the inner circle is what we need as humans and what we need to deliver the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The outer ring is where we overshoot our needs and result in climate change, etc. But where we need to be, according to the city of Amsterdam, is in the inner ring. And that is where it's safe for a safe and just space for humanity to live and work. And in that context, they are trying to ensure that their city is in the inner ring. I guess if you turn to Chinese cities, what they have been doing already before COVID, there was a huge movement towards facial recognition technology. So for example, if you wanted to travel on a bus in China, it was very common that you would have your iris scanned, that would connect to your, you know, digital account, and that would be how you buy your bus ticket to travel on the bus in China. But now it's not just buses or public transit. You know, it's for all kinds of facilities. You're having either your iris scanned or your phone checked to check, first of all, have you got COVID-19? Are you at risk of having COVID-19? You know, you have an orange or green code, for example. So you're seeing this huge addition of digital technology being leveraged in cities in China to deliver services. And that includes digitally enabled delivery services. It includes 3D printing, for example, rooftop spaces, etc. So they're really focusing on the digital recovery in China. I'm going to talk about a city which is closer to home for all of you. And I must preface this by saying the Mayor and the Chief Executive of Belfast City Council set up a Growth and Innovation Commission, and I'm a member of that. So that includes, for example, the Vice Chancellors of the University, it includes the Head of the Chamber of Commerce, it includes a number of state agencies, etc. And together we are asked to try and, you know, come up with a future strategy for the growth and development of Belfast. This is one of the early papers that we recently prepared, and this is all about delivering a sustainable and inclusive recovery. So, you know, central prongs of this are how we can have a jobs-led approach to community energy efficiency. So one of the things that we recognized in the city of Belfast is it's a post-conflict city. So in a post-conflict city, you have a lot of problems. You have problems in terms of health, you have problems in terms of deprivation, you have problems in terms of segregation that you need to address as a city. But for example, one of the things that you have is a huge amount of public housing stock, which is owned by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. And there's a real opportunity to borrow, to actually retrofit those assets, which has many added co-benefits, because the people who are living in many of those houses are living in energy poverty, have poor health. So there's many benefits that can be delivered by spending a relatively small amount on community-led energy efficiency. The second thing that we are focused on in this strategy is city centre renewal. So that is increasing the densification of the city. We had many bomb attacks in the city of Belfast during the Troubles, so the heart of the city was depleted. And this is about bringing back people to the heart of the city and making sure that it's a dense city rather than a sprawling city. There are longer term items that we have in this strategy, which is actually around the connection of the city to other cities that it needs to work with to be economically viable and to survive and thrive. That's its connection to the City of London. That's its connection to the City of Dublin. And I'm not going to go into that, but I'm happy to take questions if you have any questions in relation to that. I also wanted to flag what the C40 mayors have been working on. So C40 is a very powerful mayoral network headquartered out of London, where a number of you sit, and they work with 95 cities around the world to address climate change. And when COVID happened, even though they were primarily focused on addressing climate, the mayors decided to exchange on their experiences with regard to COVID-19. And it was decided that they would work together on working towards a green and just recovery. And that group was chaired by the Mayor of Milan, Beppe Sala. And I guess there's a number of key principles of that recovery. So, whilst cities may be at different stages in terms of their city development plan, they as cities have agreed to 9 principles that they will stick to in terms of delivering their recovery. So in that context, and London, by the way, is one of those 95 cities as well. So what they're saying is the recovery should not be a return to business as usual. We need to address climate. The recovery must be guided by adherence to public health and science. We must deliver essential public services. The recovery must address issues of equity. The recovery must improve resilience. And, so not just in terms of climate change, but health shocks, financial shocks, etc. The climate action can help accelerate the economic recovery, and we can leverage innovation and technology to create jobs. The recovery from COVID must be healthy. They must ensure that national governments support both cities and investment in cities, and I'll come on to that later. And we must ensure that the international and regional institutions invest directly in cities. And one of the things that concerns me in a place like London, for example, with Brexit on the agenda is, historically, the UK has been a member of the European Investment Bank. I do not hear any mention of an investment bank being established in the UK. So who exactly is going to be investing in the recovery? I think that's a key question. Whereas, Ireland, for example, I know a number of your members are also from Ireland, can leverage the European Investment Bank in terms of its recovery. However, one of the big risks of a recovery in cities is the finances. And I don't know if some of you read the New York Times, but there was an article in the New York Times, which was in the New York Times yesterday, and it was about 150 business leaders warned the mayor that there's huge anxiety over the future of New York City. So New York is having to lay off 22,000 people, is having to cut services, and that's because of its huge budget deficit as a result of COVID-19. And this slide, for example, is designed to show you what revenue cities have, what expenditure cities have. But if I go into detail in New York, in terms of its agreed budget, was meant to have a deficit of 1.7 billion in 2020. However, the city of New York is currently looking at a deficit of just over 8 billion. That is very significant. And why are they having that deficit? They're having that deficit because of lost revenue for transit, lost revenue for tolls, lost revenue for sales taxes, and very significantly lost revenue as a result of property taxes. But they've had increased costs in terms of health, in terms of sanitation, and in terms of feeding people. One of the things that New York, was worried about when they needed to close their schools was what will happen to children in impoverished neighborhoods that normally receive breakfast and lunch in their school. So they had to, of course, come up with a mechanism to feed those children. But they also found, because so many people had lost their jobs, that they had to feed families, not just children. So whilst the example of New York is very significant, it shows us the bleak financial position of our cities. So their ability to invest in recovery, their ability to borrow before impacting their credit rating is called into question. So I think we have wonderful strategies coming forward, but how are we going to finance it? I wanted to briefly turn to the real estate sector as well. And I guess there's the short-term aspects in terms of what has been happening in real estate, and then there's the future scenarios, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. So, we've seen sales being blocked. We've seen people not wanting to buy apartments, for example, wanting to buy those larger houses in the countryside. We have seen government moratoriums on evictions, for example. We've seen a lack of need for student housing. We've seen the hospitality sector suffer. We've seen, Airbnb suffer, people not wanting to travel, so not using Airbnb properties. We've seen this huge drive to working from home. And we've seen that retail is moving to omni-channel. And yet we've seen logistics increase, the demand for logistics increase. So in terms of the change that's been accelerated in the real estate sector, what is likely to happen? The first one, in relation to living, I think is not something I like to be saying, but unfortunately I think it will be a reality. Many countries and many cities are on life support right now. When that life support turns off, jobs will be lost and foreclosures will kick in. So unfortunately, we will see a lot of distressed residential assets, and we will see huge demand for social and affordable housing. We are also seeing this demand for sustainable buildings. It was existing before, certainly, working with the real estate industry, they were very much focused on delivering net zero carbon buildings, but now it's with added co-benefits in terms of health and well-being. We are seeing what we call a hub and spoke model in the real estate sector, and indeed just on Wednesday I was talking to the CEOs about this. So this is where you're going to see smaller demand in the centre and more demand also for smaller units in the suburbs. So that questions what's going to happen with our CBD, Central Business District. And by the way, that's living, that's office, that's retail, and I'll come on to that in a second. We're seeing increased demand for health services. We're also at an inflection point in terms of an already overheated student housing sector. When we had our CEOs, the real estate CEOs meeting in Davos, there was concern already about overheating in the student housing sector. And it's believed that that's obviously at an inflection point now. Co-living models are being questioned. Hospitality is in distress. So we will see new types of hospitality emerging, particularly our hotels are in distress, our restaurants are in distress. In terms of offices, I'm at pains to highlight that I do not believe the office is dead. And in fact, Andreas and I were talking about this earlier, and I was mentioning Carlo Ratti, who is the director of the Sensible Cities Lab in MIT and an architect, and somebody I work with all the time, and indeed a good friend, has done some research in MIT, which is looking at interactions in MIT across departments before COVID and interactions post-COVID. That's analysing all email communication within, for example, MIT. Before COVID, there was a huge amount of cross-department interactions because people were informally seeing each other. People were in MIT. And that was allowing for them to exchange on what they were working on and seeing where there were synergies. However, since COVID, that has all but disappeared. So the argument is that our informal connections we are losing because we're working from home. And as a result, we're not going to be innovating. So whilst in the short term, we may see a big movement towards working from home, we will come back. And IBM did this a few years ago. They wanted everybody to work from home, and then they reversed that strategy. So the office is not dead yet, albeit remote working will form some part of our working week. Retail, we've seen a huge shift and will continue to see a huge shift to omni-channel retail. And if we learn something from cities in China, who already had a shift to omni-channel retail for a number of years, retail will become experiential. So we will experience the product in our retail stores. And as a result, the size of facilities that we need will be smaller. And logistical space, because of the shift to omni-channel, will increase. We're already seeing the likes of Blackstone moving huge amounts of capital into logistics, for example. In terms of what we're working with the CEOs from the real estate sector on, we are focused on getting the industry to transition to deliver livable, sustainable, resilient, and affordable real estate. And by livable, it's addressing health, it's addressing well-being, it's addressing productivity. By sustainability, it's the net zero carbon agenda, it's the ESG investment principles. By resilience, it's ability to withstand future shocks. And by affordability, it's around providing the supply and the quality of housing to ensure that we deliver affordable housing. And of course, enablers of that are in relation to technology, regulation, talent, value proofing, and stakeholder engagement. However, a big risk is again capital. And in October, we're bringing the global CEOs of banking and the global CEOs of real estate together, as well as bringing in city leaders, to have a discussion around how do we ensure they do not turn off the tap? How do we get investment in green buildings? How do we rethink distressed assets and not apply a blunt financial instrument? How do we get investment in affordable housing? So, what we've learned from previous recessions is that they turn off the tap and then we have a lack of supply and the affordable housing problem becomes even greater. So that is just some food for thought for our discussion today, and I'm going to wrap up there and hand back to Andreas and Stephen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alice. That was quite an avalanche of really things to think about. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Lots of different angles you presented the issue from. And in fact, there are lots of different questions from our audience. I'm going to start by inviting Seymour, who is in Brighton. Seymour has mentioned a number of different points, but he started off with the cycling backlash. So can I ask you please to ask your question, Seymour?
Oh, sorry. Yes, Andreas, thank you. Sorry, just finally got unmuted.
You got there. Okay.
Might be behind the control. Hi, Alice. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm all right. It's been a while.
I know, it has.
Listen, so one of the comments I said, I think to summarize, there's two things. So this whole thing about 20-minute, 15-minute city neighborhood, there's two issues that come out of that. And I think on that, drawing from Melbourne, you had employment hubs in that sort of top left-hand quadrant. So that's the missing piece I'm finding. So there's a lot of investment. I mean, you'll know about the government COVID health and walking and cycling fund. Brighton and Hove put in a bid. We're now having to return some of that money because we wanted to put in cycle lanes, but then found out that we didn't consult, so that money is going back. And the issue there is that debate about cycling for leisure versus cycling is commuting, if you like, again. So that comes back to the employment. So what do you do where you don't have employment hubs? And I loved your sort of model where you've got a spoke in the middle and various things going on. It depends on distances. So there is that. And I wonder whether you've come across any evidence where that's actually worked. But again, that transition to local employment versus, say, people commuting Brighton to London or Belfast to somewhere else, for example. How do you overcome that? And the other point was, you mentioned the EIB And I know when Suma left the EBRD, there was a lot of chatter about EIB versus EBRD. And there were a lot of people saying, we need the EBRD. And I just assumed that because the EIB were kind of pushing the other way. I mean, where is that debate? And are we going to end up with both of them? Because again, Kevin put in a note about a Scotland Development Bank. There's talk about an England government-supported development bank. So is that the way forward? So, yeah.
So I'll take your first question first, and then, last question first, and then the other question. So, you know, the way I tend to think about the EIB versus EBRD is the EIB tends to be an EU bank, if you like, whereas the EBRD would tend to, most of its lending in the area of, you know, city infrastructure that we're talking about, is in the Balkan states, sort of Eurasia. So it's not really in the EU. And so that's how I differentiate between them. One is an MDB that focuses on the EU, albeit in fairness, the EIB do lend to projects in Latin America, etc. So it's not just the EU, but it's primarily the EU. And the EBRD would tend to be the Balkans and so on. One of the things that, you know, should the UK have an infrastructure bank? I believe it should. And, you know, I particularly refer to what they did in Canada and how they thought about a strategy for rethinking their cities, their villages, their towns, in terms of a green recovery, but also how would they finance that. The first thing they did was they had a smart cities challenge, and they call it smart cities, but it was really about sustainability and, you know, revitalizing aged infrastructure. And that visioning exercise was done bottom up. So the cities, the towns, the villages were given a set of criteria, and they came up with a vision for their cities, towns, villages. And there was an award which a city or a town or a village could apply for, which gave them some initial funding to be able to implement that vision if they won the award. But the second thing they did as a government was they doubled infrastructure spend. So recognizing that infrastructure is incredibly risky and that the private sector will not invest in risky infrastructure projects, they doubled capital spend at a national government level. And the third thing they did was they created the infrastructure bank. So, you know, the vision became the pipeline of projects that investors needed to have certainty and to invest in Canada. And of course that was costed, so Canada knew what it needed. And then you had capital infrastructure, and then you had the infrastructure bank. So I think that that's a very good model to think about. And it's, again, it's regarded, Canada and Australia would be the world leaders in terms of trying to provide infrastructure. Turning to back to cycling, I think there's a huge educational component. And, you know, when I lived in Ireland, we had something called Antashka's Green Schools Programme. And they have green schools programs around the world. But the Green Schools Programme was so important in that they went in and educated children about cycling and how to cycle safely. You know, they worked with parents to create cycle buses where communities would cycle together towards schools, because most of their congestion was around schools. They had walking buses, so communities could walk together towards the school and created, you know, safe communities walking and cycling together to schools. By virtue of doing that, they also, by the way, have a lot of activities in terms of how you grow food, how you recycle, you know, teaching them about the environment, all of those kinds of things. And it gets government funding, but it's also funded by corporates. It's run by a charity. It's like the National Trust of the UK. That really changed things, because you change the hearts and minds of kids, and then you change the hearts and minds of the mums and dads and grandparents, because the children were doing it, the parents were doing it. So I think that's a really important point. It's not just building the infrastructure, it's the educational piece as well. In the city I live in Geneva, they've, you know, delivered cycle infrastructure with a very blunt instrument. They've just shut down a car lane in every part of the city. So now they've created you cannot possibly drive through the city. So as a result, people are on public transit, you know, they're walking, they're cycling. in even greater numbers than before. So they forced people into it in using a very, very blunt instrument. But I think you need to do both. You need to deliver infrastructure, but you also need to deliver the education.
Thank you, Alice. I want to go back to the investment point again, because there were quite a number of comments on that. Can I ask Kevin Murray? Kevin, you mentioned the example in Scotland, and in fact, you made a number of different points. I feel free to put them to Alice, please.
Thanks. Can you? Yes, hopefully I'm up.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Thanks, Alice. Thanks for a great presentation. My point in the investment bank was really there are others trying to copy and follow up. So there's been a variant of the Scottish one as an investment bank, which is trying to expand. It's come through Parliament. I think you're right. They're looking at models like Australia and Canada. And I think the chair, Willie Watt, has come through a background in organizations like 3i, which was I think it was investment. It was a model of exactly this model from the early 80s, I think. So these examples have existed, and they keep being to some extent privatized and then coming back as public or public-private institutions. It's in relative infancy in Scotland, and it isn't easy. So what I wouldn't do, Andreas, was hold it up as a model yet, but I was flagging it up as its evolving status. In the same way that Samra was referencing, there might be an English one coming out, in the same way that people like Michael Heseltine have argued for regional banks, which is what was the case, would have been the case 100 years ago or 150 years ago, often drawing from a regional catchment and supporting regional industry. So that might be another kind of model, but scalability is clearly an issue, and managing risk, particularly as you've said, for infrastructure, which is where some of the big transformational things in either cities themselves or linking parts of city regions. But thanks for the presentation. I thought it was fantastic.
Kevin, whilst you are on, you also commented on the cycling backlash. Would you like to based on, yeah.
I think it's great that there have been a number of the responses, including the one from Dunleary, I think it is, where we're saying that has been well accepted. And I think it's mixed. So lots of them went well when there was less vehicle use. People were at home more, vehicles were slower, and the acceptance of public space for everything from picnics as well as cycling was. What's happened is with gradual post-lockdown activity, economic activity, school activity, student activity, and so on, and in some places tourism pressures, is that there have been more vehicles and more activity, and sometimes the tension has grown, and in some places they've withdrawn some of the vehicles. What I would say is that a lot of this, the benefit, hopefully, and it's come up in other things we've done as an academy, is connect to the neighbourhoods. It's not just about either the city centres or the town centres or the resorts and so on. It's getting to because more cycling and walking in the local neighbourhoods help the health and well-being. A point I think you were making. I think the other kinds of things you were talking about on Airbnb are worth picking up with others, because I think
yeah. Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, you mentioned the Dunleary example. Can I ask Tara Skakey, please, to make the point and ask your question? Hello, Tara?
Start my video. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Tara.
Great to hear Dunleary for the second time online today. It was very interesting because the cycle lanes came about at with the support of a new sustainability professional we had in our council, who came on board in July, and within 6 weeks had installed cycle lanes, which had been in planning for probably 15 years. So it's interesting that in Brighton and Hove they're rolling it back, whereas we're doing a little bit more of a nudging forward effort, really, in that the first start was to get people cycling, and the pathways that they have go along the beach, so they're beautiful. You know, they're great locations. But there are issues in the city centre where they're trying to install similar pathways with parking access, and you know, it's highlighting the problems we have with traffic here. But there doesn't seem to be a rollback effort happening yet. We're hopeful. Having said that, they did put them forward as being temporary measures in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown. Mm-hmm. So I guess we have to wait and see as to whether or not that they will. I don't think they're going to be removed, though.
They look pretty permanent, Tara.
That's what I was thinking. They've done an awful lot of work, and it's been very expensive work. And the cycling has jumped. I'd say it's at least doubled.
Yeah.
In the last month or two that they've been put in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
I happened to be in Ireland over the summer. I had to do my 2 weeks of quarantine and then 2 weeks of vacation. So I seen the cycleway that's been rolled out in Dún Laoghaire, and I thought, what a wonderful way to commute to the city, the whole way along the sea. Fabulous, fabulous cycleway.
Yeah, and they've done a lot of really nice work with putting in kind of divisions between the traffic, which are metal, which resemble waves, and they're just very beautiful. Yeah. And I think they would encourage the local people to buy into it more, which maybe that's one issue in other places, that they're not making them look as well or work as well to get the buy-in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. Thank you. I'm just going to move the debate on to a different point now. Stephen B., you made a point about the Airbnb. Can I ask you to ask the question, please?
Well, thanks, Andreas, and thanks, Alice. It was a good example of high density stimulation. So really stimulating for me. You mentioned almost in passing the impact on Airbnb of the virus. And it just strikes me that maybe organisations like Airbnb and maybe digital taxi services like Uber may prove to be a short-term exploitation of the convenience that digital communications provides, and that actually they'll be found to be a parasite on urban housing, as has been found in the campaigns in Barcelona and Paris and other places, and on urban transport, and indeed on the tourism industry, which we've seen collapse over the last few months. And the implications of the loss of employment in the collapse of the tourism industry may perhaps encourage us to think again about the way that we use this tax on this avoidance of tax on laziness. We might define.
I think you raise really good points there. I think the first thing is there were a number of cities who were banning Airbnb because of the impact on affordability. And if you think in the city of LA, Santa Monica had actually banned Airbnb, but Venice, which is just beside it, hadn't banned Airbnb. And Santa Monica was a livable neighborhood where people, could occupy housing. Venice, it's Airbnb. But Berlin had banned it, and Paris had put a tax on Airbnb, and, had ensured that there was health and safety officers in the city to assess every single Airbnb property. But one of the most interesting pieces in relation to Airbnb that I have seen since COVID is actually in the city of Lisbon. So, the city of Lisbon said, there's all of these properties that were Airbnb properties. How about I think about becoming the mass landlord and trying to, rent them to people for social and affordable housing? So I think that will be very interesting to see how that pans out. Another thing is that many of those people who owned those Airbnb properties, particularly if they weren't renting a room, but they were renting an entire property, they were they were living on the buy to rent model, right? So their mortgages could be in trouble. It's believed that many people who had buy to rent properties, mortgages likely will be in trouble in the next number of months, and they may be looking to offload them, or they may be willing to do what Lisbon did. You know, they may be willing to talk to the city authority about making those properties available for social and affordable housing. And I think that's a really interesting conversation that a city could start having en masse with people who own these properties that they were previously renting out in Airbnb.
Okay, thank you. Alice, there was a question from Alex Saint about the 15-minute principle. Alex has just had to leave, so I'm going to ask the question.
Okay.
The question really is about the 15-minute. It doesn't cover everything. You know, there are obviously many other events and activities that are outside that. And I think Alex's point was that we shouldn't really ignore that the fact that you know, there's quite a lot of life outside the 15 minutes, and
So you know, it actually brings me to something. I'm worried about the central business districts of cities. Why am I worried about central business districts? I'm worried because the type of retail that's going to be demanded is changing. It's going to be experiential, so the size of units is going to reduce. So we're going to have a lot more vacancy in our central business districts. I'm worried because a lot of our restaurants and bars won't survive this recession. Our cultural, you know, our theatres, a lot of our music venues, which are in the centre, may not survive. And I'm worried if organizations like Google, you know, one of the things that happened very recently is, you know, Google were in advanced discussions about acquiring a major building in Dublin. They've now decided they're not going to do that because, you know, they have their employees working from home. If you start to see these short-term decisions, there could be a lot of vacancy in offices as well. I think that Google will do what IBM did, realize having everybody working from home doesn't work either, and will bounce back, and, you know, offices will come back. But I am worried about the health of the central business district. I'm worried about the knock-on impact in terms of loss of property tax, loss of commercial rates, and how that will impact, you know, city revenue. So I'm concerned, and I think that real conversations need to be happening between cities and the real estate industry around how we can sustain our central business districts, because Alex is right. Our central business districts are there for a reason. You know, there's the agglomeration effect that results in people wanting to be in the central business district, so we can access the best talent, etc. And they will need to exist. But I think the model that's being proposed now is that we have the hub, which remains in the central business district, and we have the spoke. But as a result, if we go for the hub and spoke model, there will be a huge level of vacancy still within the city centre. Yeah,
okay. I have a question as well now. It goes back really to the point you made about the digital technologies, particularly in China, which are coming into cities to deliver different services. And you also spoke about mental health and the isolation and the human need to speak to each other. These two are contradictory. You know, the trend towards more digital technologies is directly proportional to, you know, probably greater isolation and mental health. Yeah. How do you see reconciling the two?
I think it's interesting you should say that. I live in Switzerland and I have a son who's 2.5 years old. And, you know, I remember when my son was born, one of the first things a doctor said to me is, you know, we do not allow children to use screens until they're at least 6. And I was like, oh, okay, I didn't actually know that. Now I know it, thank you. And I think it's the message I've heard most frequently from doctors, from nurses, from health visitors, social workers who would interact with you as a parent ever since. And they strongly believe that it impacts a child's development, mental development. So, you know, constantly the creche, the schools reinforce it to parents about not using screen time. so of course it's Switzerland. It's a country that's very rules focused. People do abide by the rules. So, you know, other countries may not be willing to follow that model. But I think that a balance will need to be struck. We will increasingly want to digitally detox, get away from technology. But at the same time, technology is an enabler, and it's an enabler of us, for example, delivering net zero carbon buildings in a smarter and efficient way. But it's in the background, not in the foreground. And I think the other thing is that, you know, if you look at the allegations of human rights violations that are emerging from cities in China, do we want that in our cities? I think the answer is no. Amsterdam, for example, the chief technology officer of Amsterdam would tend to be the, you know, the chief technology officer that's really at the forefront in Europe and North America. And they are using facial recognition technology, but you cannot see the face of the person. So you cannot determine the race of the person, the gender of the person, you know, nothing about the person. But they use it to, you know, if they see citizens are, for example, too close to each other in an area and there's a risk of them contracting COVID-19, or if there's, you know, if they're breaking the law, they're able to deploy police forces to go and break up whatever's going on. I think that that's a much more sensible way to use facial recognition technology than what we're seeing in China. We are seeing that a lot of the large technology companies in the US are now saying, we are not going to use facial recognition technology because of this discrimination that's been found to be associated. So I don't think we are going to go in the direction of China anytime soon in cities in Europe or cities in North America.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you, Alice. There's quite a few more points, but I can see we're coming close to the end. I'm going to give the opportunity for the last question to Anna Macmillan, who has a question about your home city.
Okay,
hi.
perfect.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much, Alice, and thanks, Andreas, for still making some time for me, for my question. I have a question about the strategy for Belfast city centre. We're actually working on projects where we've been asked to look at how we can shrink some town centres in terms of shrinking their retail area. So I work in sort of more urban design for real estate, for the real estate side of things. And they've asked us to look at sort of consolidating the city centers, reducing it effectively, changing some uses from retail to residential, but at the same time, changing to lower densities, because the trends we're seeing in real estate is that actually smaller, sort of more dense apartment types, like 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, are actually in decline, and people are preferring lower density developments, like much more suburban housing, housing extra space, meaning space for people to work from home, with a garden. And that does present a challenge to having those typologies in city centers to create density for retail and for facilities to still be viable. So just wanted to hear a little bit more about your proposition for Belfast and any thoughts around these kinds of concerns, which are coming from sort of driven by what we're asked to design and to relook at the moment.
I think you've raised a really important point, and recently I was talking to the CEO of Lennar, which is the largest house builder in the US, and we were talking about, you know, that they're seeing this huge demand for suburban housing, but even suburban housing is changing and that people want a home office now, you know, no longer the standard suburban house. And I don't think we were particularly positive, either of us, about that conversation, because we do not need to be using more of our land. We do not need further sprawl. In fact, the economics of delivering infrastructure requires us to have density. However, what I would say is density is not about height. Density is about consistent density across a city. It's about, you know, ensuring you don't have sprawl. Density is not New York. Density is Barcelona, and actually Barcelona is greater density than in New York. So we're aspiring towards a Barcelona model, you know, in terms of the way we're thinking in Belfast. The other thing is we're aspiring towards quality. So if you're delivering apartments, they're apartments that are of a sufficient size that you actually, they're not, you know, tiny apartments. They're of a sufficient size that you can live. They've got storage, they've got access to green roofs, you know, community spaces, play facilities. So they're an alternative model, and you know, a good way of living. So you're within easy access of the city centre, you're, you know, within easy access of your work, etc. Just the second thing is, Belfast is a city that's probably quite unique in that obviously it's a post-conflict city. So there's a huge amount of vacant land that wasn't redeveloped after conflict. So there's a huge opportunity within Belfast to sort of fill in, it's more of a donut type effect now, and to sort of fill in that circle, if you like. So Belfast is unique in that regard. Also, another thing in Belfast is there's a huge amount of land in public ownership. So there's an opportunity for the state to bring forward development. I think that in relation to the city centre, city centres everywhere, retail's challenged, but you've got to actually think about, how do we bring back a living above the shop? Because, you know, previously, for example, a lot of those spaces above shops were empty, completely empty. And yet we could bring them back and have people living there. What are the alternative uses, short-term uses that we can bring to bear for leisure facilities that are in distress? Can you convert hotel accommodation into residential? Yes, you can. So, you know, I think that we need to think creatively about how we can rebuild our cities. And in the case, for example, of Melbourne, the city is looking at how they can work with the creative sector and the cultural sector to rebuild its city core. And I think that's important as well.
Fantastic. Alice, we've run out of time. I'm going to mention one last point that Shane Mitchell has made. We haven't got time for him to ask the question, but he was commenting on your possible decline of the CBD as a result of all these changes. And he suggested that maybe this will lead to a more polycentric kind of way of working, which may in fact be a welcome change. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
We will.
There's lots of other comments and questions from our audience. You've managed to raise quite a lot of enthusiasm, Alice, as I was sure you would do. It was a tour de force. We are grateful that you've given us this presentation. And as we discussed before the session, I'm sure that we'll be delighted if you were to join the Academy
I'd love to.
At some point.
Yeah.
But for the time being, thank you so much. Everybody has enjoyed it. And I hope that you will enjoy your afternoon walk later on in the sunshine.
I'm going to enjoy Lyon. So if you follow me on Twitter, you might see lots of pictures of Lyon. That's what I do as an urbanist when I go to a city.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alice. And thank you to all of you for being with us. And a very good afternoon to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andreas. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Olga. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.